Get out. Oh my God.
Hello, and welcome back to the Madiswan channel. My name is Madison, and today we have another installment of True Crime in Society featuring Women's History Month. So we're going to be talking about a particular situation that involves women, that involves women's rights, and that situation is Korean comfort woman. If you've been here before, you know the drill. Hit the like button, comment on the video so it does better in the algorithm. If you are a newcomer, thank you for coming. Thank you for supporting my channel by watching this video. If you like, subscribe, hit that notification bell so you know when I have another video. There's so much content for you to catch up on, so go back in my repertoire and watch all my videos if you will. And for both of you guys, you had better watch my ads because it helps with me being able to make more content for you and build my content and build my channel so I can do this full time. So if you're interested, do all of those things, interact with the video. Mwah, I love you so much. And if you're curious on where else to find me, hit the description box. All my socials that I use are down there. My Instagram is going through a bit of a maintenance period. I'm about to pop out with some hot stuff once I, get my summer body on and all of that stuff. So be ready for my new Instagram revamp, but I do post a lot of reels about the videos I will be doing in the next week or the next month. So if you're curious about what I have down the pipeline, subscribe or follow me on Instagram. Definitely do that. And I'm way more active on TikTok. So even though TikTok might be canceled, but anyway, we are almost 108,000 strong on TikTok. So I go live on there. I post on there regularly, so if you want to really keep up with me, go to TikTok and follow me. Mwah. So, as I stated in my first video for Women's History Month, which was the Puerto Rican birth control trials video, if you haven't seen that yet, please check it out. I am doing my True Crime in Society videos focusing solely on women's issues. So a couple weeks ago it was the birth control trials, and this week we are going to be discussing the topic of Korean comfort women. Now, if that's not a term that sounds familiar to you, or if you never learned about this, stay tuned because this is an extremely dark history related to Japan, Korea, and World War II all wrapped up in one. Before we get into the story though, I just want to have a really solid trigger warning. This is an intense story that involves sexual violence, sexual slavery, child trauma, lots of stuff like that around war and violence. If that is not your cup of tea, if that is not something you can stomach, I would ask you to either watch this video on mute to help the channel out, child, or to just skip this one altogether for your mental health, because this is a dark history and a dark story. For those curious about how this relates to true crime, if you haven't been here before, I'll just do my quick spiel before I get into the whole topic of this video. My channel is not your average true crime channel. I take historical things, I take individual things, and I look at it with a sociological lens. My goal with this channel is to redefine what true crime is based on its actual definition and not its social definition. The actual definition of true crime is reporting on a crime that happened in the past or whatever. That is it. It is a very vague definition, but for some reason we're socialized to believe that a true crime story has to involve very particular things, which isn't true. To me, I think war crimes are true crime stories. I think what happened with Big Pharma and the opioid crisis is a true crime story. I think what happened historically with the birth control trials and experimentation on people of color and all of that kind of stuff is a true crime story. I think slavery is a true crime story. I think Hiroshima is a true crime story. And these are all things that we will get to eventually on my channel. But my goal with this channel is to widen the definition of what true crime is, while also centering only BIPOC individuals, meaning Black, Indigenous, people of color, and their stories and platforming their stories, because as you know, we rarely get the shine. So that being said, that's my quick spiel. Let's get into the discussion and the story, the very dark history of Korean comfort women. As I said before, trigger warning. So I think the first place I want to start is when world-ending, world-shaping, world-changing historical moments happen in our global society, not only do the women in those places, in those spaces during that time have to sit with what is going on around them, they also have to remember the fact that there are also women going through this particular situation. Now, men have a different experience with world-ending, world-happening situations and how they work through that in their mind when they experience it. But as a woman, you have to remember that there are also the stratifications of society, and when those get dismantled, the protections that you have, it is fair game, and it is so much more dangerous to be a woman in those situations when the world collapses, right? And one of those instances where world changes, world shaping, world stopping moments happen are oftentimes in war. And in wartime, a lot of the unspoken traumas that end up happening happen to little girls and women living in these places, living in these spaces, and having to experience this particular time. So when it comes to all the other fears that we have societally, that society barely recognizes and barely protects us from as it is, imagine when society devolves into complete chaos and you have to travel and protect your little girl, protect your family, and you're a woman. There are other dangers that are added on to just the normal danger of the situation. This brings me to my second point. When I tell you Japanese culture has done a complete 180 rebrand that needs to be studied by all marketing professionals ever, it is actually insane. Because the Japan during World War II, during the 1930s and all that time versus what Japan is now and how people regard it, it needs to be bottled. It needs to be studied because, child, when I tell you there are still older Chinese people, older Korean people, older Filipino people that do not trust the Japanese, there is a really deep, really dark, very violent history attached to those sentiments. And we never talk about it. And honestly, America in general is very ignorant to world issues, particularly the intricacies of different Asian nationalities and why they don't get along. That is not typically on the American radar. It is something that I'm pretty ignorant about myself, but I do know more than the average bear about it, which is why I'm discussing it. But when I tell you what Japan did under the guise of World War II, are some of the most atrocious, disgusting things that you can ever fucking imagine. And we're going to dive into one of those experiences, which is the experience of Korean comfort women, as well as Chinese comfort women, as well as Taiwanese comfort women, and Thai comfort women. I called it Korean comfort woman in particular because I think they created a bigger proportion of the population who were comfort women, to be honest. But Korean comfort woman, or the title comfort woman, does not solely cover just Korean women. It covers all of the Asian countries and South Asian countries that Japan went after during the 1930s and during this time. So I just want to be real with you about that. So I think the most important place for me to start to provide context for the situation, is the massacre of Nanjing in the 1930s in China, Nanjing, China. Now, I learned about this in a sociology class, as I learned most of my stuff and most of my way of thinking, of course. But it's not common knowledge, and it wasn't common knowledge for many, 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 many years until a Chinese woman, found images in her research and realized and uncovered the hidden history of what happened in Nanjing during the 1930s. Now, for those who don't know, and there was a TikTok actually weirdly that came up, I think in the past 2 years, where a man had found a book of pictures in a thrift store, I think, and they were very never before seen graphic images of what went on in Nanjing, China during the massacre. And there's lots of complicated ways that he was, trying to profit off of it, but that's a, palm colored situation, and we can get into that at a different point in time when I actually do a full true crime and society story on that whole situation. But we forget sometimes when things are introduced into the cultural zeitgeist and become normalized and become widely spread knowledge that we learn about. And it's surprising that for many years, what happened in Nanjing, China was hidden deliberately from the public zeitgeist. So, people didn't talk about it, didn't reference it, didn't have pictures to prove that it even happened. So a lot of times it was ignored, it was poo-pooed as not real or some fabrication. When this particular author, the author of The Raping of Nanjing, she got harassed, and I think she ended up taking her own life due to what happened in the backlash of making that book. She was the one that put it on Front Street, and I believe that was in the 1980s or the 90s. So imagine that time period from World War II and the ending of World War II to the 80s when she finally dropped the book. I mean, that's 40 years at least, and that's more like 50 years since it actually happened. So if you don't know what I'm rambling on about, what happened in the Nanjing Massacre was it was a part of the Japanese very offensive military effort to basically conquer a lot of Asia and a lot of the world. The goal was to conquer the world. And this was in the 1930s, around the time that Hitler started to do his thing and World War II started to crack off. Now, what happened in Nanjing was the Japanese military went into this very particular area, which is Nanjing, China, and decimated it to embers. They killed all the men. They raped all the women. They murdered children. They burned things down. There were very few people who survived that experience. And because there were very few survivors, there were very few people that could actually, speak to the existence of this being a historical fact that it happened until the pictures were discovered. It was a hidden history for a very long time. It is a very dark history because the amount of people that were killed per capita was some sort of insane number, like over 300,000 people were murdered in a very short span of time. And the Japanese military did this to the Chinese people of Nanjing. Now, that happened in the early 1930s. And one of the most disgusting acts that came out of that time was the physical sexual assault of young girls and women in Nanjing. And when that happened, and it came back to the Japanese government that this had gone on and this is what happened and how brutal it was, and there were barely any survivors, and what these men were doing to the women in particular, they were disgusted by it. But instead of rethinking a military strategy, rethinking how to train these men or anything, they focused in on the fact that it seemed like that the Japanese military men needed to blow off steam sexually in order to perform properly and decently when they were taking over different Asian countries and, dominating and fighting in this war. So instead of addressing the mental, the sociological, how these men were actually dealing with having this power and entering these spaces and just decimating all the men and raping all the women. What they thought the solution was to create Japanese military brothels that were very close to where they'd set up camp, and have men go to these brothels daily to let off steam, so that when they were actually going into another area, another territory, it wouldn't be as brutal as what happened in Nanjing. They truly believed that this would work. They truly believed that this was respectable. And they truly believe that this was, it was the best solution in the face of what happened in the Nanjing Massacre. Obviously, it was a flawed situation. It was a flawed reading of the situation. We all know that. I mean, it doesn't take a rocket science to know that it went bad and it went poorly. But essentially, that is why the concept of a comfort woman started to exist, because of what happened in the Nanjing Massacre. And again, like I said, I plan on having a full True Crime and Society video on that, so stay tuned for that. Now, these brothels, these military ran brothels, were, always, if you saw a military base, there was likely a brothel right next door. And soon they realized that demand was outweighing supply. So the demand for these women, for these brothels, for these sexual experiences, was outweighing the supply of local Japanese women that they had at their disposal, who were either sex workers, forced into sex work. We can get into the nickel and diming and logistics of that in a little bit, about how they got women into these situations. But point blank period, Japanese women population in these brothels was dwindling, and they needed to meet the demand of the military men in order, in their mind as a government, to stop another massacre like what happened in Nanjing to happen. So what did they do? Well, when they would infiltrate other nations and other countries like Taiwan or China or Korea or the Philippines during this time period, they made sure to capture women, right? Kidnap women and bring them to work in these brothels. So this is where, to me, I need to take a moment. I've never been against sex work. Get it how you live. Do what you want to do. And I'm going to have another conversation more in depth about women who use their sexuality to get what they want. I don't think there's a problem with it. The reality is, these women were being kidnapped, or in particular misled, tricked, or sold into working into these brothels. These were young women, not adult women, underage women, who were being tricked and bamboozled into working in these brothels a lot of the time, or straight up kidnapped. And so it turned from, and I'm not sure of the intricacies of the Japanese women who were the first comfort women. I don't know if they were also tricked. I don't know. I'm guessing likely they were also tricked into these positions. But I'm sure there were some sex workers that volunteered for these positions as well. When it came to the Japanese infiltrating other nations to bring other women to fill these comfort places and be comfort women, it was straight up sex slavery. Straight up. So let me just quickly name down and run down the ways that they would get women to fill these comfort homes or these brothels. One, they would straight up kidnap you. When they infiltrated your nation, they'd kidnap you. Two, they would trick the locals and say, oh, we're going to send you, now that we've captured your nation, we're going to send you to mainland Japan to work in the factories so we can get supplies for the war and things like that. They'd come over to Japan, then all the women would be, tricked into being in the brothel. They were bamboozled. They thought they were coming to work in a factory. They end up in the brothels. Another way was, there were some families that would sell their daughters into the sex slavery comfort woman role for money with the Japanese soldiers and things like that, for extra money. There was a multitude of ways, but a lot of those ways there was no consent involved in these women deciding that they wanted to do this. So essentially, it turned into a sex slavery trafficking kind of situation. These men would infiltrate, they get all the women, either trick them by any means to get them to start working in the brothels. And soon, with all the different places that they had control over, the different territories that they had control over, they were cycling women in and out like so quickly, like you wouldn't believe. So like I said previously, the goal of these brothels was to boost morale amongst the military men so they don't go unhinged like they did in the Nanjing Massacre. And the amount of specifically Korean women in these comfort woman roles at its height was about 200,000. So just think about that. Not only was the height at 200,000, but let me tell you this, 90% of women who were forced into comfort women roles, 90% of them didn't survive it. So do the math with that.
높은 군인들이 저기 앉았더라고요. 그래 이제 나이가 몇 살 먹나? 근데 저거 나이로는 14살밖에 안 되는데 좀 애롭지 않나 그런 생각을 이상하게 고백을 했던 글을 샀더라고. 그때 안을 들어가놓고 해서 안을 들어가 보니까 이생兵들 부대에서 나와갖고는 검사를 하더라고. 몸에 전부 검사를 하고는 숙소로 가라. 거기 큰 학교인가 무슨 공장인가는 모르겠지만도 이런 넓어. 그래 방울에 턱 올라서서 이래 보면은 그쪽 방에 있는 거 다 보여요. 그 누워가지고 하는 것까지 다 보여요. 억지로 끌려가서 기사대기 몇 차례 맞고 그 말로 듣고 아주 그 나이가 어리니까 피가 막 나잖아요. 담요에 피가 모두 묻고 이런 거. 그래 그거를 끌고 나리세자 끌고 그 빨래터로 올라가니까 친구 둘이도 그래 당하고 앉아가 울고 있더라고. 이래야 우리 어떻게 살겠나. 차라리 죽는 게 안 낫겠나. 어떻게 해서.
So when it came to actually populating these brothels with comfort women and stuff like that, and making sure there was an accurate amount of comfort women for the men and all of that kind of thing, they actually referred to these women as units of supplies, not as women, not as humans, not as people, but really tools in their mind as a means to an end to boost morale for these military men. So they weren't thought of as people, they were thought of subhuman. And one Japanese doctor actually referred to these comfort women as public toilets. So yeah, yay. So for a lot of these women, this was an extremely traumatizing experience. Not only were they either tricked or sold without knowledge, a lot of these women were underage and they were far away from home and they didn't know if it was even possible for them to get back home. Women around them were dying all the time because of the violence of the sexual experiences that these military men would put them through. The conditions they were in were obviously subhuman, were not clean at all. They would be kind of funneled into one room where they'd have many comfort women in a single room. And in Korea, there are museums that have a full mock-up of this that you can walk through and see the conditions that they lived in. But basically, all the girls' sections would be separated by curtains, and they'd all be provided with a small bowl of water for them to wash up after every client. Nasty and sad, and obviously not safe conditions in the slightest. And if you can imagine that these women, there was no cap on the amount of clientele a woman would be forced to engage with in this situation. So some women were being assaulted up to 10 times, 20 times, 30 times a day by the roundabout of men going through. How it worked though, it wasn't based on the amount of clientele a woman had in a day. It was based on the amount of time that the men were allotted based on their ranking in the military. So again, how it would go in particular, say you're in the Japanese military and They get a new shipment of new girls from wherever, Thailand, the Philippines, Korea, in this case, maybe Korea. The highest ranking men would get the new girls first because they were thought of as pure and untouched and unsullied. So those new girls would go to the higher ranking men. Then after they had their fill or a new shipment of new girls would come, those women would be demoted to be able to have sex with the rest of all the military men. They would likely run through, spread diseases, violently sexually assault them, sometimes even kill these women. They'd be disposed of in a very, very callous way. And then the cycle would continue. New shipment, you go with a higher, then go down, down, down. You either die, you get sick, or you get injured or whatever, you're disposed of. Then it would happen again and again and again. And that's kind of the cycle of how it would go. And I just want to pause there because I just always hate this ongoing concept about a woman's purity, being untouched and unsullied and unrustled and all of this stuff. It's always a catch-22 to me because it's like men, how do I start this? Men are obsessed with purity, and to me, it speaks to a very pedophilic relationship with what a woman is supposed to be and how a woman is supposed to act, period. This obsession with being untouched and pure is weird, but also the fact that you suddenly do not become pure when you engage with a man goes to show what they actually think of themselves, because they are the corrupting force in that situation. They are the disgusting aspect if we are disgusting for having sex with them, and our value goes lower for having sex with them. So that means that you guys do not have value. You suck value, if that makes sense. So I don't understand how they think of themselves as the highest value when actually, if we engage with you, we're supposed to be reduced to minus value because of our engagement with you. You know what I'm saying? So it never made sense to me. That idea never resonated with me and never made sense to me on top of that. And then on top of that, just on a more social, colloquial conversation about it, men want a virgin who's a freak hoe at the same time, which doesn't exist unless that woman has had experience sexually and knows how to command in the bedroom, which means she's had sex with other people before. So, but then they're supposed to also be experienced sexually, so they're supposed to be able to bed women, but the women that they're able to bed, they look down upon, and then they go to a virgin who's also supposed to be a freak hoe and know how to do all these sexual positions while also never having sex before. It never made sense. It doesn't make sense. The obsession with purity is sick. It's low-key very pedophilic and weird, and I think you guys need to unpack that knowledge and unpack and unlearn that, but you know, that's my opinion on that opinion. Girls, if you explore your sexuality while you can, that's all I'll say. Don't get caught up in what these men are talking about your value, because they don't even know what any of it means. Moving the fuck on. I just want to go back to the point about these women being seen as units of supplies, being disposable and all of this stuff. And going back to my first point in this video about how when the world ends, when war happens, there's a war happening and experiencing the trauma of that. But as a woman, as a young girl trying to survive, it's a whole other ball game. Entirely. And you realize how quickly society can fall apart in terms of protecting you, even though it barely was doing that in the first place. Because once all bets are off, all bets are off. This is an unspoken situation with women who are in the military, women who have to go overseas and fight for their country, as well as women who are victims of war. I don't even know if there's an accurate measurement of what actually goes on during wartime, because this doesn't just happen in the old-timey wars. This happens in all the wars we've been a part of. This happens in all wartime. It's currently happening in the Russia-Ukraine war at this point in time. There have been reports of mass rape. There have been reports of mass brutalization. There have been reports of situations very similar to the Nanjing Massacre happening in Ukraine at the hands of Russia. There is something with war, there's something how soldiers are indoctrinated and all of that, nationality is indoctrinated and all of that. that creates situations like these, particularly very dangerous and tumultuous situations for women. We end up paying a different price, not only the price of life, not only the price of being scared and the trauma of what you see during wartime, but we end up paying the price of flesh a lot of the time as well. You see, there are reports after the blunder of what happened when we left Afghanistan, which maybe I'll do a True Crime and Society video about that, because I want to get into all of that mess and my opinions about it. But there were reports of 10-year-old girls as young as 9, 10 being sold to older men sexually, or being married to but sold to older men sexually, in order to make sure the family had money to be able to survive, because what happened in Afghanistan is a whole mess and a lot of their money is non-existent. And so when society crumbles like that, it devolves into this situation, and unfortunately a lot of women end up being the victims of this crime of the flesh that people don't really want to acknowledge, don't really want to talk about, because I think deep down they don't know if they're even above acting like that. There's a whole documentary called The Silent War on Netflix, if you're curious, which goes and discusses the silent war that women have to deal with being women in a mostly male space. Women are raped all the time in the military. It is often covered up. I did a video on Vanessa Guillen, who was killed on Fort Hood. There was a whole other Latina woman who was an officer who was killed on the same base with the same complaints and the same reasons of being sexually harassed by a higher up that never got acknowledged, and then she ended up dead. So there is this war within a war when it comes to femme presenting people, women identifying people in a society when it's going to shit, and we don't talk about that enough, and these women had to experience it firsthand. And I just want us to understand that this is not an isolated incident. This isn't just integral into the Japanese military. This happens. Any war that you have ever heard of, this happens. So get used to it. You know what I mean? And then on top of that, those women are then looked down upon because of what they had no control over experiencing, which is this most disgusting part. These women weren't doing this, especially in this context, weren't doing this because they wanted to. They were forced into it. They weren't cuddling with these men. They were being murdered by these men. They were being used by these men. They were being abused by these men. And they were being tossed out and disposed of by these men because they weren't even thought of as human beings. So as we get further into this story of comfort women, and again, this is kind of, I can go more detailed in maybe a part 2 or a different story or something like that. I can go into maybe a woman's more particular story if you guys are interested, but this is more of an overview of this history of this practice of comfort women. Some of you might be thinking, why isn't this bigger history? Why isn't it talked about worldwide? When we talk about World War II, why isn't this openly discussed? And I think an important thing to remember is history is mostly constructed. It's not really a institution based on telling the complete truth, which is why I have this YouTube channel. History is pieced together by ideas, conceptions, and perceptions that people want you to glean off of situations, and it's very rarely based on telling the cold, raw, unfiltered truth. And particularly in the 1930s, up until, probably 80s and 90s, up until present day, what you are told about what is happening, what you are told about government involvement, what you're told about certain bad actors societally in this country and every country is heavily censored, period. And in the 1930s, baby, you would be lucky if you're getting a kernel of truth when it came to the news, because there were very big monopolies on what the news and what was filtered and what was discussed. a lot of people during that time were heavily propagandized by arms of the government, working with Disney, working with other studios in Hollywood to let you know who the enemy was and why they were the enemy. There's lots of negative portrayals of Jewish people, Asian people, Japanese people, German people, all of that during World War II as a direct hand from, the government, as well as Disney and other media companies in Hollywood. There's a concerted effort to make sure to make people excited and supportive of the war by the news that they were able to discuss and the news that they kept secret. That isn't unique to the United States. That happened as well in Japan as well. And the reality is, in wartime, people are able to kind of make things less concrete, if that makes sense. For example, when it comes to the Armenian genocide and the Turkish government never acknowledging it, what they say is it was war, it was World War I, those people died in war, and they were prisoners of war, they were in war, and that's how those people were killed. When in actuality, an opportunity was seen by the Turkish government to systematically kill these people without anyone really paying attention because of the war going on. It wasn't because of the war that this happened. The war was a cover-up for this to happen. It would have happened or in some way or some form anyway, but it was a perfect hideout to hide in plain sight, to basically be like, oh, they died in war. It had nothing to do with a systematic trying to destroy an entire group of people's existence. So the Japanese government took a page out of this book when it came to discussing the truths around comfort women existing. They denied it. They said it was wartime. They hid the truth. They hid, any documents relating to the truth. They burned documents. They destroyed documents. When it came back up, they denied. But they can't deny the truth. And nations seem to never understand that. When it comes to America, when it comes to other nations that have committed huge atrocities towards people, they think they could hide behind wartime or hide behind, oh, there's no evidence, there's no pictures, there's no whatever, without taking into account the firsthand experiences of the people who survived it and their right to tell their stories. And you can't hide from that reality, and you can't hide from that truth. And the more you try to cover it up and not acknowledge it, the more it festers, the more it gets infected, the more it bursts up into violent, crazy ways, as we're seeing in America about, the gay stuff, the trans stuff, the bills against teaching even a semblance of Black history in school, like all of that shit. It's because people are running away from just sitting in the truth that these things happened and this existed. And the Japanese government has done and continues to do the same exact thing when it comes to the realities and the truths of comfort women. Oh, they destroyed the documents. Oh, there's no documents documenting that. Well, you burned them. Oh, it was wartime. We didn't systematically do this. This is just a rumor. And they dismiss. They refuse to put it in the history books in Japan. They refuse to acknowledge it openly in Japan. They refuse to do all these things in the hopes that if they refuse it long enough, there will be a generation of people who come up who just don't really believe that it happened or think it happened. But the more that you offset that, right? The women, the people who are a part of the lineage of people who experience these atrocities, the families of these comfort women will never forget, and they will continue to bring it up more and more and more. So basically the denial started early with the Japanese government. Again, they dismissed it. They said it was communist propaganda, this and that. They didn't and still don't want to acknowledge this reality. Until the Kono statement, which is a statement that is often referenced as the first time the Japanese government really acknowledged that this even happened. Not tried to make it right, just acknowledged that it might have existed and might have happened. The Kono statement was made by a high-up government official. His last name was Kono. This happened in the 1990s after the first group of comfort women came forward and discussed their experiences on a worldwide scale. He came out and basically said, he wasn't the prime minister, he was just high up. There is evidence that this happened, that the Japanese military of the time was systematically forcing women into brothels. And that was it. That's what he said. That's what the statement was basically reduced down to. There was no acknowledgement that these women deserved any retribution. There was no public apology by the government. It was just one man high up in the government that said, yeah, there's stuff that points to this being true. That's it. They didn't moralize it and say it was wrong. They didn't say we're going to pay you. We didn't say anything. That was the first time it was publicly acknowledged, in the 1990s, no less. So after that statement was made, again, there's no governmental institutional apology towards these women. They didn't add the history of the comfort woman into history texts in Japan at all. But what they did do is open up a fund for people to donate to give money to survivors of this atrocity of being a comfort woman. So they're half admitting but also not admitting. And at the same time, this was a fund that citizens of Japan donated to. It wasn't a governmental fund where they allotted an amount of money from the government to give to these women because it was a governmental run situation. They had the people of Japan pay these women. So again, it's like half saying that they acknowledge that it was real, but also not wanting to take full accountability or responsibility so that people can say, see, you acknowledged it was real. You know what I'm saying? So it's just a lot of half stepping. It's so sad when you hear some of the more intimate details of what being a comfort woman in the aftermath of healing and surviving an experience like that by comfort women who are called grandmothers now that they're in their old age. So I will now refer to them as grandmothers. The grandmothers, when it ended, the war ended, and they had to figure out how to pull their lives together, pull themselves together after such an insane experience, a traumatizing and violent experience. What happened was, specifically with the Korean women, a lot was going on. They were in a state of trying to rebuild, but then at the same time, the government, the United States and the Soviet Union were playing tug of war with their government and their society and how they did things. So there wasn't a lot of downtime enough for these women to gain the courage and the ability to speak out about this. Not only was there not a lot of downtime, and they were made to feel like their experiences were like, but we went through war, but the men fought in the war. So what are you talking about isn't, worth talking about. There wasn't a lot of space created for their truth. But on top of that, we had geopolitics at play that was destabling actively their place growing up right now post World War II. So there wasn't a lot of space made, and there wasn't a lot of space to make because they were dealing with another situation involving geopolitics and war in their home country. So a lot of these comfort women carried it, ate it, never spoke a word to it, never told their families, never told their parents, never told anybody until they were inspired to. And the reality is, they carried that shame, and some who spoke up and told their family about what they experienced were shunned by their family, were shamed by their family because of things out of their control. So there was really not an incentive to speak out really about their experience as comfort women for fear of being ostracized by their own community, but also societally there wasn't a lot of space to be sensitive to what they experienced, unfortunately. It wasn't until 1988 when the current governmental dictatorship that was into censoring a lot of what was said publicly and what could be spoken about in the public conversation fell, which was 1988, that women's groups band together and they really took advantage of the time and started talking about their experiences as being comfort women and gaining confidence and creating these groups and these safe spaces to express themselves. And then it started building into a national conversation about their experiences as grandmothers. And it took over 50 years so think about this. It took over 50 years from the initial situation happening for them to even feel the comfort and the support and the ability and the confidence to speak out about their experiences without shame publicly. It took 50 years for them to even talk about it, let alone getting money, let alone getting an apology, let alone fighting for legislation for this information to be put in the history books, let alone any of that shit. It took 50 years for the first woman to come forward and speak about it publicly. Ciao. The unfortunate reality which we're seeing today in America as we slowly descend into fascism is that more and more people are realizing that history is created and it can be skewed as more and more time passes between the actual event happening and people talking about it publicly and their experiences of that event. Japan has installed for years, trying to really publicly acknowledge and really remedy the situation, particularly to the women who are forced into being comfort women. They have tried to sabotage. They have tried to make these conditions that cannot be agreed to. They have tried to hide the history. They've tried to blame it on communism. They've tried to discredit these women and gaslight these women into silence. And they are not giving up. The grandmas who are still alive are still fighting and still being resilient about their experiences and letting it be known publicly. A lot of people believe Japan to be this utopia, believe Japan to be this place that is unlike America. It's clean. They have all these gadgets. Everything works so efficiently. But the reality is they were only able to get there by having some of the darkest, most brutal, most violent history to ever exist in another nation. And they're able to kind of bypass acknowledging a lot of the bad stuff they did to other people in other countries because now they have this reputation that's shiny and platinum. And the reality is the only way to truly move on, move past, and grow as a nation in a legitimate way is to always acknowledge what you did in the past, to always apologize, to always try and look back and make things right and remedy mistakes for these women. And they're just not doing that even now. My history teacher always used this example in class in high school. Shout out to you, Mr. Grice. She would talk about how Germany dealt with post-Holocaust Germany and how they single-handedly changed their reputation by refusing to not acknowledge what happened in the Holocaust, refusing to look it in the eye and to make sure to make monuments and to make sure to acknowledge and understand this history because it was so disturbing they never wanted to go back there. So they were able to change the public perception of what a German is. You don't think of a German person as a straight up Nazi these days, and that's because they acknowledge it, they talk about it, they talk about it openly, about the truth of what they did as a nation during that time and how it affected people's lives from here on out, and they don't shy away from it. They're able to grow in truth without constantly being burdened by their past in a way that isn't just honest and truthful. With America, we try to hide, we throw stones, we hide our hands, we're the best, we're the most free, we're the most this, patriotic that, without ever sitting there and being like, yeah, well, you keep getting called out for war crimes because you never made right on the war crimes you did. You keep getting called out for being domestic terrorists to your own people because you never apologized for slavery. You never paid people back for what they did in slavery. You never acknowledged what you did to the Native Americans. You just moved on and expected all of us to move on who are a victim of what you did to us. And that's just not how it works. We're going to keep bringing it up. We're going to keep talking about it and talking about it in a way where you owe us because you're never trying to acknowledge and make right what you made wrong. And so it'll always be a part of, that's the second part of the conversation, America, and then you talk about what you did to the indigenous people, then we talk about slavery, because you will never get out of that being a part and attached to your name and your nation until you make right and do what you can to actually physically remedy what you did and the damage you caused. So for the Japanese government to be hailed this way, That's why I said we needed to bottle and package up what kind of marketing they had, child, because at the end of the day, the fact that they're seen as this just like super polite and super clean place, when in actuality some of the most disturbing things happen at the hand of their government that they're still refusing to acknowledge, is sick. And it's important to talk about the totality of a person's history, a person's existence, as well as a nation. Period. In Korea, every Wednesday in front of the Japanese embassy, they acknowledge the history of comfort women. They have performances, people come, they dance, they sing, and if one of the grandmothers is feeling well enough, because obviously they're starting to die out and everything, they will be bussed in to speak about their experiences. And this happens every Wednesday in front of the Japanese embassy in Korea, which I think is beautiful, and it shows tenacity. It shows that their voices won't be silenced for any more decades, and they will continue finishing out the rest of their days speaking about their experience and educating people about the reality of what happened to them, which I think is beautiful. In 2015, both the Korean president and the Japanese president had a conversation where they basically publicly said, we're going to put this comfort woman conversation to rest, and basically acknowledge it, move on, and be able to grow as two countries together. But what the Japanese government was asking the Korean government to do in order to get to that place was far too much. They were basically requiring all of the statues and monuments made in Korea, acknowledging the existence of comfort women and what they went through, to be taken down, all of the demonstrations to be stopped, and basically that didn't happen. Students were being bussed in to sleep at the monuments for days on end, so they couldn't take them down, and it ended up staying up, which is wonderful. I'm super happy and proud that they continued to fight for the comfort woman and the acknowledgement of the comfort woman, because clearly the Japanese government doesn't want to talk about it and doesn't want to truly acknowledge the problem. But also, the sad part is different comfort women monuments around the world, like in the Philippines, for example, got a lot of pressure from the Japanese government, and they were forced to remove it. So again, clearly not trying to really in good faith acknowledge this history and move on with the conversation. They just want people to stop talking about it, even though they're not acknowledging it. In Korea, anti-Japanese sentiments still remain, but they're fading, and as they continue to fade through time, they're going to continue to fade. But yeah, that's kind of where things are left with the history of the Korean comfort woman. They are still fighting to this day for acknowledgement. They're still fighting for this to this day for an apology from the Japanese government, and hopefully it comes soon. I remember learning about this story for the very first time, and it was honestly jarring and shocking, especially learning in the same, on the same note, the massacre of Nanjing and how that related to the existence of comfort women. I think I knew that women had it worse when it came to wartime, but for this to be so systematic, a systematic sex slavery trade that encouraged the abuse of women, and have it be so black and white, to me was really shocking when I heard about it for the first time. Clearly these women are still fighting for acknowledgement. They're still fighting for recognition. They're still fighting for their place solidified in history, and the acknowledgement of the Japanese government to acknowledge and apologize, and to make sure that the kids in their country learn about this and don't forget, or this history never gets forgotten and lost with time. In fact, they're encouraging the erasure of these stories to be publicly heard, which I think is really gross and really scary. Ultimately, I thought this was the perfect story to put into Women's Month, because there's so many backdrops about common woman issues, uncommon woman issues. There are so many discussions to be had about the experience of these women and the shame they felt, and how it took 50 years for them to publicly speak on their experiences. Like, I think it's just an important conversation, particularly for Women's History Month. So I'm so glad I was able to incorporate it this month. I know March is coming to an end. If you haven't watched or seen all of my March videos, please make sure to do that. I did birth control trials. I did a documentary reaction, a doc talk that I hope you guys enjoy. And I also did this story. I'm going to be going live next week doing YouTube tips for a lazy bitch for March because I need to. So stay tuned for that. I will be going live on TikTok as well as YouTube at the same time. I tried it once and I loved it. If you haven't gotten a chance to go into my repertoire, what I did last week, I did live where I talked about Shanquilla Robinson and the updates with her case. So go to my live tab on my channel and check that out. Again, all my descriptions, all my social medias are in the caption, so please do that. And also stay tuned for my 75 hard journey video. I hope it comes out soon. I am working hard, child, to get back to where I want to be. That's a conversation for another day, but I'm documenting that also on my TikTok, so stay tuned for that, child. But yeah, that being said, I guess all I have to say is Black Lives Matter and free Palestine until it's backwards.